Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Utility Sports. Hope you guys have been enjoying all of the NBA draft content for the 2023 NBA draft, as we are less than 3 weeks away. Now, at the time I'm recording this, super stoked for that, but I kind of thought now would be a great time to flash back to some of my previous boards. In today's video, we're going to look back at my 2021 NBA draft board, see some of the things I hit on, some of the things I missed on, which is really important because I think this is a great learning tool on, hey, what did I misevaluate and how do I go from making mistakes like this and kind of trying to learn from that and adjust my rationale for maybe some of the prospects even this year. Now, I don't want to completely flip the script on what my gut's telling me year in, year out, but I do think it's important to go back, learn, look at what worked, what didn't work, and potentially revisit the tape as well to see why or why not I felt a certain way about a prospect in terms of ranking them on my big board. I'm really excited for this video. If you are as well, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, especially if you're new. We would love to have you be a part of what we're doing here at Utility Sports. And let's jump forward into the video with my biggest hit from this draft, and it was Herb Jones. I actually had Herb Jones ranked 26th, and in my draft profile for him, I really raved about his defensive versatility, the ability to challenge on all three levels. And if you've watched him in the NBA, that's not a surprise to you anymore. But 26 maybe doesn't sound very high for Herb Jones. I went back and revisited some big boards, specifically looking at Sports Illustrated's big board. They had him ranked 46th in the draft. And you have to remember, it's kind of easy to flash back and say, oh, well, obviously this guy should have been higher or lower. But at the time, you have to kind of remember some of the context. Herb Jones was an older prospect. Offensively, there was questions about his jump shot and how he was going to impact winning, and if you could even play him offensively, if he was going to be anything more than, say, the fifth best offensive player on the floor for your team at any given moment. I think obviously the defensive pros of Herb Jones have significantly outweighed any of those offensive cons, and I think some of those offensive cons have developed a long way as well, to the point where my ranking at 26 is probably too low even, but it's still a huge hit compared to where a lot of other people I think had him viewed in the draft at that point. And I'm very proud of my Herb Jones fit. I remember watching him at Alabama. I was just so impressed with, obviously his wingspan was so incredible, but at Alabama he basically played center defensively for them, played a little bit of point guard offensively for them. They also had some other nice offensive pieces around him back then. So it's not like it was a one-man show offensively, but he would initiate some offense for them. And defensively was just kind of all over the floor. He would switch out in space and defend. He was their primary rim protector at Alabama. I think he's a really great tale of, if there's a good senior or a good older prospect, don't be afraid to rank them high just because they're a little bit older. In fact, you should feel pretty confident about ranking them high because you already know that they're pretty good. And if you look at the history of the NBA draft, the biggest misses oftentimes are 18, 19-year-old kids who we have less film on. There's less actual data because they've only played likely 1 year in college. And sometimes your projections, it can mean a lot if they actually develop in the meaningful ways that you expect them to. Herb Jones didn't need much development stepping into the NBA, and the areas that he did need development were really easy for the New Orleans Pelicans to focus on because he already had such a well-rounded game outside of that in terms of passing the ball. He was pretty solid at that at Alabama, and then also defensively, I mean, he was, day one able to fit right into the team. And I think that's a really great tale of maybe something to look for in the 2023 draft is, how does this guy fit in? How is he going to be able to adjust? What does a development pathway look like for him on day one of his NBA career? And I think Herb Jones is a fantastic example of that. So not only was he my biggest hit, but then my biggest miss was the guy ranked at 27, and it was Franz Wagner. And again, this video is not to say, oh, look, I was right about everything. Franz Wagner has been a really great example for me to learn off of because I was really wrong on him. Most drafts I've got like one really bad, one wrong, like, hey, I was way off on this guy. And part of the reason that is I don't work off of consensus at all. To be honest, I don't look at other big boards throughout the year. Now, if you guys comment your own big board, I read it because I read every single comment on the channel, but I don't actively go out and pursue and search other big boards. I don't look at other mock drafts really. everything at Utility Sports is 100% my content. So sometimes it's going to lend itself to me being really right about a guy, going against the grain, say a Herb Jones, because I'm not looking at the grain, but sometimes I'm really wrong. And a lot of people were significantly higher on Franz Wagner than I was. And even though that was the consensus at the time, I wasn't just going to act on that and say, well, I'm going to blindly put my trust in that. My eyes did not tell me that when he was at Michigan. And I think there's a few reasons as to why, and I've learned a lot from it. Sometimes when you look at a player in college or wherever they may be playing right now, NBL, Overtime Elite, a couple examples, Shaedon Sharpe last year, you had to watch high school film, which is very helpful, by the way, watching high school film. Even if there are college players, I would definitely recommend watching high school film. I watch a ton of high school film, even on the guys who are in college right now. I think a great example of that is maybe Anthony Black. His high school film is very telling to what he was going to be in college. And then if you go back and revisit it, you can see some of the things he's still very good at and makes you intrigued in him even a little bit more. But Franz Wagner, for me, there was a few things I didn't like about his college tape that maybe I should have looked at differently, and I think I've learned from that. Specifically, one of those things was kind of his offensive utilization. Juwan Howard, kind of uses a lot of zoom sets and dribble handoffs, and he also does a very good job coaching guys to go downhill on the catch. So a lot of Franz Wagner's actual production in college came off of those things, like catching the ball and ripping and going right away, or catching the ball on the move toward the rim. And to me, at the time, it felt like, hey, a lot of his success is scheme-based, where he's getting put in situations where he's in advantage, and because of that, he's finding success. And I think I also undersold his athleticism, and I think I undersold kind of his height. There was also some rumors at that time still that he was maybe still growing, and some of the physical stuff, I think I overlooked kind of what he was as an overall prospect. And that is one of the harms too of formulating big boards a little too early or maybe a little too frequently, is board to board you don't have as much movement between players, and you give yourself less time, especially if you're making a bunch of big boards, to go from, hey, this is where I view this player a couple months ago to where I view him now. Because if you do one, like, say, every week, which I do a mock draft every week, I feel like that's completely different than a big board, because my big board's my own ranking. And if you do a big board every week, you're probably not going to move a guy very much week in, week out. Because of that, you kind of stabilize that prospect into a specific spot, instead of just saying, hey, here's my current big board. I'm going to now go back over the entire draft class, rewatch every single prospect, watch film, every single make, every single miss, every single possession, every single game I possibly can, which goes a long way in really telling you what a prospect is. You have to watch full games to really get a good feel and understanding of them, because it feels different than just watching tape, which is something that's really tough to do for most people, because it's a big time commitment. For me, I do it, I love it, but I understand why some people don't. But if you kind of crystallize a player into a certain realm of the draft, which is I think what happened with me and Franz Wagner a little bit, you'll notice as I've kind of gone throughout YouTube here, I've done less big boards. I've only posted 2 full big boards this year, because I'm kind of wanting to take my real precious time with them, instead of saying, yeah, I think this maybe works, and then kind of moving stuff around a little bit. Now, you can still get to the right answer by forming a lot of big boards and making adjustments, small ones at a time, just based on what you've seen recently. But I think really combing over the entire draft is a really great way to do it. And I think that is something I learned from Franz Wagner, because I overlooked some really important things with him. And I kind of thought his success was more scheme-based, when really it was his ability to take advantage of those advantage situations and really cash them in frequently, which is something he's done really well for Orlando. I think just that kind of pace of play and the way that he manipulates a defense, specifically when he is cutting and when he's catching the ball with the guy having to rotate out, he attacks closeouts very well. I was just wrong on a lot of things on him. And 27 obviously sounds like a ludicrous ranking. It is, but I'm very glad to have learned from it and used kind of my experience from that for the better. So getting into where my final top 10 rankings were from this draft, and you're going to see there's some hits and some misses in here too. Alperen Sengun I had 10. Remember, he was coming out of Turkey, and I even remember discussing with my best friend. I was telling him, I think, hey, look, Alperen Sengun has the talent level and the potential inside-out skill set with the passing capability to maybe be one of the best players from this draft. And I had him ranked 10th because I was a pretty big believer. He was very productive in his time overseas, which typically that's a pretty good indicator that the guy's going to work pretty well in the NBA. Right now on Twitter, for some reason, I see people comparing Alperen Sengun to Enes Kanter. Those two guys are nothing similar. Alperen Sengun this past year was more productive than Enes Kanter ever was in the NBA. I think Alperen Sengun has a significantly higher ceiling. His passing vision is worldly, all worldly, to be honest. He's one of the best passing big men in the league already, and he's not very mature yet as a player, and I think there's a lot of learning he has yet to do. And the one thing I want to say about this as we go through the top 10, I just want you to keep an open mind that, again, we're not crystallized with where these players are going to have finished their careers at. We're 2 years into it, okay? So Alperen Sengun right now at 10 maybe feels kind of accurate. 3 years from now, maybe he is the best player in the draft from this year's class. Or maybe he's the 7th best, or maybe he's 15th if other players end up stepping up and getting opportunities to showcase their talent. And I think that's the thing, is we need to keep an open mind. Even though maybe the first 2 years have been better for some, worse for others, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily the way that you're going to rank these things. And, you know, I see comments all the time of, oh, well, this guy did better his rookie year, so he's the better. I mean, the whole point of drafting a guy, especially toward the top of the draft, is not for their first year or even their second year. You're hoping for like a really good 8 or 9 year window. And really that window should considerably begin by year 3 or 4, where we're like, okay, yeah, this guy, we're starting to get a really good feel for what he maybe is. Just because you actually have real sample size behind it. You can see some of the progression that the guy's made throughout his career. But I feel pretty good still about Alperen Sengun in my top 10. I think he's still a very talented player. And honestly, some of his success came under Steven Silas, who didn't even believe in him as an individual player. I think with Ime Udoka, assuming that Udoka doesn't kind of switch things up and go to more of a defensive-minded big, Sengun could still find some serious success in Houston going forward. Moving on to 9, and this one is one of those misses. I had James Bouknight 9th overall, and again, I don't want to say this is crystallized and that James Bouknight is not going to end up panning out, but so far the early indications aren't great on it. He just hasn't played a ton of NBA minutes, hasn't played a ton of NBA games, and he's been doing that for a bad team. The fact that he's not getting on the floor a ton is obviously a red flag, and then also some of the off-the-court issues he has had as well does not help his case either here. So if you're looking at a player who just did not live up to some of those expectations, specifically the ones I place on him, I mean, James Bouknight falls into that category so far, 9th on my big board. And for Bouknight, I definitely bought into the potential 3-level scoring capability. At UConn, there was moments where the guy was lethal and just could not miss seemingly. And he was really kind of the definition in this draft of maybe a tough shot maker from college. You think about kind of the other prospects in this class, not really a lot of other shot makers, especially off the live dribble, like what James Bouknight had possessed at the time. Now, if you were to ask me again in hindsight, would I want to stand by this ranking? Definitely not. And again, there's things to learn from this with Bouknight. Maybe I overlooked some of the playmaking issues, and maybe I didn't have as much information on some of the character that he was as a person, because I do want to tell you, NBA teams care a lot about character and how you present yourself during interviews and during some of those things that are more than just basketball. And you might say, well, why is that? These are multi-million-dollar investments for teams. You think about the rookie slot, how much they're going to get paid on their first contract, and usually the numbers are up into the 20 millions. That's a pretty big investment to be making into an 18 or 19-year-old kid. And if you don't feel good about their character, if you have issues around them that surround them, that's going to be something that does raise some concerns. Does that affect Brandon Miller this year? My guess is probably not as much, because teams still like to prefer the talent. And I don't even think Bouknight had as many of these character concerns that I know of when he was in college. But I do think that it's important to try and get as much information as you possibly can. Sometimes that can serve you well. Sometimes that can hurt your perception on a player. Because I remember pre-draft for Anthony Edwards, there was some concerns that Anthony Edwards wanted to go play football and that he wasn't really serious about basketball. Now, looking back in hindsight, that is completely ridiculous to say. Anthony Edwards is a fantastic young player, and if you listen too much to some of those things and you doubt the talent, you end up hurting yourself too. So I think that's one of the things I learned from Bouknight. You kind of need to have a fine line with where's your talent evaluation at. And for me, Bouknight was a really big riser toward the back end of the process. For the most part of the year, I didn't like Bouknight that much. And then toward the end, after kind of revisiting the tape for like probably what was the 80th time, there was just some extra things that I was picking up that I was like, well, there's not another guy like this in the class in some regards. And I like his just combination of length, size, and shot making was so intriguing to me that I ended up bumping him up pretty significantly from my memory. Now, whatever that means, right? Maybe 8 or 9 spots. It's not like I had James Bouknight at like 40 and then all of a sudden moved him up into the top 10. I probably had him somewhere in the teens and then moved him up into the top 10. So with Bouknight, there's lessons to be learned, and I think that's really the healthy part of going back and looking at this. At 8, I had Davion Mitchell, and I was in love with Davion Mitchell's perimeter defense, specifically how good of a point of attack defender I thought he could become. And I really do believe we've seen that so far in the NBA pretty quickly into his career. Obviously, the nickname Off Night fits him very well because he does do a really good job challenging around the rim, or not around the rim, excuse me, just challenging on the perimeter in general and being competitive and physical and playing with bumps and doing a lot of things you need to do to be a good defender on all 3 levels. And in extension to that, he does a great job in the full court. And I think that's a very underrated element of point of attack defense. I think that's a very underused element in the NBA is the actual use of full court pressing. And not necessarily like, hey, we're going to get a steal and we're just going to out athlete you, like what we kind of see in high school and some colleges as well, where they just think, hey, look, we have so much length, size, and athleticism comparatively that we're just going to press you and try and get steal after steal after steal and layup after layup. The NBA, you're just not going to force some of the higher end guards into some of those mistakes. But what you can do is drain the shot clock, and maybe they get the ball over with 17 seconds left on the shot clock instead of 20. And does that completely alter what kind of set that they can run and how comfortable their guard is getting them into a set? And I 100% think the answer to that is still yes. And really, if you want to have a reason as to why Davion Mitchell is probably still maybe worth a top 10 pick in this draft, look at Game 7 of the first round this year, Kings versus Warriors. Davion Mitchell, I think, had done a very good job on Steph Curry the entire series. Now, Steph's Steph, he's going to get his, but Davion Mitchell really made him work for it, and there is some real benefit to that. And then in Game 7, Mike Brown pretty much went completely away from Davion Mitchell. He only played 8 minutes, which was a real head-scratcher for me because in those 40 minutes that Davion Mitchell was not on the floor, Steph Curry ended up popping off for 50 points in that game. And it was just, I think Davion Mitchell's value in that series was incredibly high, even though offensively he hasn't perfectly adjusted to the NBA yet. And that was one of the concerns on him coming into this draft, was what does the offensive game look like? And where does he go from being kind of a pick and roll ball handler at Baylor, which he really developed in throughout his college career? And what if he's not running in that role? And I think that's one thing I did learn from Davion Mitchell is, look, even though he's a really good college ball handler, he's not going to be a primary ball handler in the NBA. There's not really a pathway for him to do that in Sacramento now with Sabonis there, but specifically De'Aaron Fox was kind of already a roadblock for him to begin with. Now, the one thing is when you formalize a big board, you don't really know where a player is going to go. And I think that really the NBA is a lot about kind of fit and scheme and system and where you land and the opportunities you're given. Maybe if Davion Mitchell goes to a team that doesn't have a De'Aaron Fox at point guard, which is kind of rare now because there's a lot of talented point guards around the league, not all of them De'Aaron Fox level, but there's a lot of talent. Where does Davion Mitchell maybe go? That gives him a spot to be a primary or secondary ball handler on a little bit more frequency. And what does that look like for his development? Because maybe we have a completely different narrative around Davion Mitchell at this point. But still, from a talent level, the defense is really what sold me on him. And I think it's justifiable to still have him in the top 10 if you were to kind of go back and re-rank. As of right now, maybe there's some guys you'd slide ahead of him, but I think he'd still at least garner some discussion in this range, which is really all you can hope for if you're making a big board. It's not like you're going to have every single player at the exact right spot that they belong, but if you're in the ballpark, you're doing a good job. And it really comes down to, hey, what's the difference between my 8th ranked guy and my 9th ranked guy? And if I was drafting for a specific team, if I don't need a point guard, maybe you go with the 9th ranked guy because he's a little bit bigger, stronger. The one thing I wouldn't do is take the 16th ranked guy over the 8th ranked guy because of fit. I think that the NBA is a lot about talent, And if the talent's close, then you can go off of fit. But if the talent's not really that close, you should just draft off the talent. And Davion Mitchell, still a pretty talented player who I think impacts winning in a good way. Number 7 here is one of my favorites from the entire process, Josh Giddey. If you actually didn't know, Josh Giddey was really one of my favorite players in this draft, and a guy that I mocked him in the lottery way before anyone else did, because I was a big believer in his game, and I've become a very big believer in the NBL, not only as a development pathway into the NBA, but just the overall play style is so similar to the NBA. They play very quick, up-tempo. It's very different from the EuroLeague, which is a slow-down game, a little bit more monotonous, and definitely very heavy usage into sets. The NBL, a little bit more pick-and-roll ball handling, a little bit more isolation scoring, more 5-out, a little bit more 4-out, and just kind of more natural, like kind of free-flowing offense. And I think that is good for NBA prospects because they get a little bit of a taste of what the NBA is going to be like for them, where there's going to be high usage players, there's going to be non-high usage players. It's less equal opportunity like what you see in the EuroLeague. And because of that, it's a pretty easy league to look at and say, how does this fit into kind of the NBA? How does this guy adjust? And Josh Giddey throughout the entire process was just such a smart player. You remember on draft night, there was the entire meme from the TV broadcast, basically, that Josh Giddey's weaknesses were everything that had to do with basketball. And that was just funny to me because people who were less exposed to Josh Giddey didn't really know what his game was about. And when you see a graphic like that, it leads you to believe that your team did a terrible job drafting. And for me, I love Josh Giddey as a prospect. I was super high on him, obviously ranked him 7th in this year's class. Kind of wish I had it higher. This is one I just do think I'm a little bit wrong on, because I think I bought in a little bit too much to the athleticism. And the one thing I have to say about basketball and just sports in general, even a little bit, if someone's a fantastic athlete and still wasn't good, that's kind of a concern for me. Now, people like to look at athleticism as like an uptick for potential, which I understand some of that rationale as well. I think there's good logic there. But think about it this way. If you're bigger, faster, stronger, quicker, or more athletic than everybody you're playing against, and you're still not being better than them or beating them, that's kind of a red flag about your skill set. And Josh Giddey was kind of the exact opposite, where maybe he wasn't as athletic as everybody else. He wasn't as quick or fast or strong. He didn't jump out of the gym, but he was good and he was productive and he was putting up numbers and he knew how to run a pick and roll and he was smart. And those things are super important. And the one thing too is I think his quickness was underrated. I actually included that in my draft profile on him. Just a little quick short write-up on Josh Giddey that I had, but talked about how he kind of makes up for some of his athleticism with quick burst moves and quick decision making. And Oklahoma City, after drafting Josh Giddey, they kind of formed their entire DNA around him, I would want to say, where they can dribble, pass, shoot. They've got smart guys who know how to drive and kick and just make the right play. And I think Josh Giddey is kind of the foundation of that a little bit. Of course, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is their best player. Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren, 2 huge contributors as well to that, especially Holmgren next year. But I think without Josh Giddey, the kind of makeup of the team would maybe be lost a little bit. Going into 6, here is Jonathan Kuminga, a player that I loved during the process. And this is one of those examples here where we don't really know what Jonathan Kuminga is yet in the NBA, because he went to a team focused on winning championships and he has an actual NBA title to his name now at this point, because he did win a title with the Golden State Warriors. But I think one really important message from this is if you go to a team trying to push for chips and try and win right now, it's really difficult to just prove your worth as a young player in this league, because when we get to the playoffs and you're trying to win, a rookie who doesn't really know rotations and doesn't really understand some of the high-end defensive stuff you have to win games in the conference finals and the finals, you're going to get nixed out of the rotation. And that's exactly what happened to Jonathan Kuminga in some of the biggest moments for Golden State. And I also think throughout the regular season, there might be an argument, oh, that's the postseason. It doesn't really matter that much, especially for a young guy. Throughout the regular season, remember, teams are worried about their seeding. Teams are worried about kind of getting their 5-man lineups together and seeing what works and what doesn't. And sometimes if you're really focused on winning a championship, even though you might have some time for development, it is very difficult to say, hey, it's February, we're trying to ramp up for the playoffs here, let's play Jonathan Kuminga 28 minutes tonight. And we just have seen some limitations because of the Warriors' attempts to win, and it's a good thing. Like, the Warriors should be trying to win. The fact that they won a title, they should not care about Jonathan Kuminga's individual development more than the fact that they won an NBA title. Like, that's just the reality. But at the same time, for me, who ranked him 6th overall before I knew where he was going, I thought that there was some really high-end potential there. I think defensively, we've seen that he's got the physical traits to be a great point of attack defender. I think he's also got the physical traits. Once he kind of gets the mental side of the game figured out and dialed in, he can be a really good overall defender just in general. And then I think offensively, this is the one thing that's where he's been really limited. Golden State, definitely a ball movement team, but also a player movement team in terms of the way that, hey, they like to play off of each other, pass, cut, move, set off-ball screens. Those are all things Kuminga never did prior to coming into the NBA. And I think that's a really massive learning curve. And would it be easier for a guy like Jonathan Kuminga to kind of play in more of a natural scheme and setting where it's all about downhill attack and get the ball and go type of offense? Yes, that would be completely different for him and an easier offense to run. Now, does it mean that it would be good for Golden State to do that? Not at all. But I do think that there is some limitations when a guy goes to a certain setting, certain situation, certain team, where we don't get to see exactly what the player was or what he could potentially grow into yet. So we'll have to monitor any Jonathan Kuminga trades. There's been a lot of rumors about that this offseason. We'll see if there's any validity to that, if the Golden State Warriors actually move off of him or not. But I still think that, like, this is a perfect example of a guy, don't sell your stock on him just because we're 2 years into his career and he hasn't done as much as maybe you would love to see. Just hold your stock. Be patient with it. Let's see what happens. Let's see where we go from here, and we'll kind of reevaluate in 3 to 4 years, like I said, when we really have a good understanding of what this guy has grown into. Moving on to number 5, I had Jalen Suggs here. And in retrospect, maybe this feels a little bit high, but you have to remember the context for the setting. This is when Gonzaga was on top of the world. They were one of the best college teams we'd ever seen, undefeated through the regular season, of course, fell short in the NCAA tournament. But you think about Jalen Suggs and kind of the moments that he had throughout that deep run for them, where they, before losing in the national title game, you think about the buzzer beater in the Final Four, I believe, to beat UCLA. You think about some of the moments that he had just in general. He was the best player on arguably the best team in the nation that year, and I'm going to be completely honest with you. I had him lower than pretty much everybody else that I saw. Most people had him at worst at 4th. And a lot of people even had him as high as 3. Some even had him at 2. I know in the beginning part of the year, there was even some discussions if he could potentially be the first overall pick, which that always made me laugh because I knew he wouldn't be with how strong this draft was, especially at the top. There was so many good players that I knew Suggs was not going to be the first overall pick. But that was kind of the buzz around him, was that he was dominating. He was the best player on the best college team. And this was after being a dominant player in high school as well. And I still think Suggs is a guy, like another player you don't want to sell your stock on. Just because he struggled the first couple of years in his career doesn't mean that he's going to end up being a bad player. And it doesn't mean that he's going to be a guy that just doesn't end up working out. Now, maybe is 5 a little high? Yeah, you could argue that. And you think about Franz Wagner. Franz Wagner has been significantly better than Jalen Suggs so far. And because of that, like, that's one spot on my board that I had to learn from. And just, we already talked about the Franz Wagner elements. What did I learn from Jalen Suggs? I think I learned shooting's important. That's one of those elements. But also just the biggest thing that I've learned, and this is over the last few drafts, I've really kind of started to pick this trend up more and more and more. If you're a guard, you're going to struggle at finishing the first couple of years in your career. And I think really out of all positions, guard is the one that we need to be the most patient with. If you want to draft a good guard and he's not one of the top 2 picks in the draft, not a generational type of guard, not a hey, surefire can't miss prospect, then you're looking at a development window. Okay, especially for guys who don't have that perimeter shot to kind of help ease them along. You think about Trae Young, Luka Doncic. Those are 2 guys who, first of all, they kind of fit that like all-star tier quality players. coming into their drafts. I missed on Trae Young. I just overlooked some of his strengths because I was kind of too focused on his weaknesses. But with Jalen Suggs, I think, the strengths were pretty evident. Like, hey, he's a good finisher in traffic. At least he was in college. And he's a winner. He's a gamer. He's somebody who he makes the right play at the right time. And defensively, he can be a total dog. And I still think he's got that in him. Part of the offensive struggles is it's hard to finish at the rim as a guard. And I think that the adjustment to NBA size, NBA athleticism, NBA shot blocking, NBA rim protection is a massive overhaul. In college, Jalen Suggs blew by everybody and oftentimes was unimpeded to the rim. And sometimes even when he wasn't impeded or wasn't unimpeded, excuse me, he still had the talent level to finish around smaller players, less athletic players. And now when you adjust to playing against, hey, say Joel Embiid or some of the other best NBA bigs, it's a complete and different game. And I think for guards, there's a big learning curve that you have to have most times. And that's why I say pump the brakes here on is Jalen Suggs a bust or what's it going to end up looking like? Maybe he doesn't pan out for what his draft selection was, but I still think that there's a really good argument that Jalen Suggs ends up being a very good player in the NBA. So again, don't sell your stock on Jalen Suggs just because the first couple of years haven't been great. Be patient. Let's see what he is by the end of year 3, year 4, and year 5, and then we'll kind of go from there and see, because really that's why the rookie deals are so long. It gives NBA teams a good sample size to base their decision making off of, and after year 4, year 5 of his career, the Orlando Magic are going to have a good idea on how long they want to tie him to their franchise for and what that kind of money would look like for him as well. So I still think there is significant upside in the type of player he can be. Moving on to 4, Scottie Barnes was my 4th ranked player in the class, and this is one that I'm very proud of because most people had him 5th or lower. And again, I don't work off of consensus, but just looking back at it, I mean, I can look up big boards now because it's not going to impact my decisions. My decisions are already done, and most people did have Scottie Barnes below Jalen Suggs, and they oftentimes highlighted some of the shooting concerns around him. But this was kind of at a time where Florida State was producing really darn good basketball players, specifically defensively. I remember the couple drafts prior, the draft prior with Patrick Williams and Devin Vassell. I really loved Devin Vassell. I didn't love Patrick Williams as much, but I understood some of the defensive upside that he possessed. And Leonard Hamilton was really on one in this little time period of Florida State Seminole basketball, because it seemed like year after year after year after year, he was just developing and producing defensive monsters. You think back to Jonathan Isaac as well as an example of that. And Scottie Barnes kind of fit that cloth perfectly. And as the process went on, I fell more and more and more in love with Scottie Barnes to the point where I highlighted him. As soon as the Raptors moved up to number 4 in the lottery that year, I highlighted him as the selection for the Toronto Raptors, even though there was some talks about, hey, Kyle Lowry's headed toward free agency. Jalen Suggs could make a lot of sense for them. I don't know. I just kind of landed on Scottie Barnes, and it felt like the right thing Masai Ujiri would do. And obviously he went that way. He won Rookie of the Year. And after year 1, people would have said maybe Scottie Barnes should have been first on your board. But I think 4th is pretty accurate up to this point. You can maybe argue he should be a little bit higher, 3 or maybe 2. Maybe even 1. Maybe there's still that argument. But again, I don't think that we have enough sample size to really strongly base that. And that's part of the difficulty of making these types of big boards anyway, is right now we're 164 games through these guys' career, and I don't think we have enough sample size to really rationalize, hey, was this right or not? But if you go back and you look at how much of a sample size we had for a lot of these guys who were mostly freshmen coming into this draft, or, some of them were older than freshmen, but most of them were freshmen. You're looking at a sample size of 30 college games, and you're looking back to probably junior to senior year of high school film. It's significantly less film than you would love to have. And that's one of the challenges, is sometimes you just don't have an actual good basis of film to look at because it's such a short season, and there's just so much that can change for a player, especially when you're considering this guy's going to a completely new city that he's likely never even lived in or been in. You also consider the fact that he's now playing professional basketball for the first time of his career. You also consider the fact that his team's going to ask him probably to do something completely different. That's the one thing I like about Toronto, is they've kind of let Scottie Barnes be Scottie Barnes. Now in year 2, they kind of asked him to do something different. That's why we saw him maybe not take that big step forward a lot of people were hoping to see, because he was learning something completely new, playing on the ball a little bit more, taking more of that point forward, point guard-ish type role And I think at best for Toronto, he's going to be a good point forward. I don't think he's a point guard, but I think definitely a top 4 player from this draft, and I feel really good about where I had him ranked. And following that up, I had Evan Mobley actually 3rd in the draft myself. I had some questions about the functional strength. I think that one element of this as well is the fact that he went to Cleveland alongside Jarrett Allen was so perfect, especially for the beginning stages of his career, allowing him to bulk up a little bit more. If you kind of flash back to the Summer League, his very first year in the league, Summer League, a couple weeks after he gets drafted, he struggled mightily in the Summer League, and some people were already hitting the panic button. For me, I tend to be pretty strong rooted in my long-term analysis, and the fact that, look, I've got a decent amount of film, again, not great amount of film, but decent amount of film, and I've watched these guys play so much college basketball that I feel pretty good about where I end up having guys ranked, especially in the moment. And Evan Mobley, a lot of people had him as a top 3 prospect. It's not like I was doing something crazy different here, but people were hitting the panic button a couple games into Summer League because he was getting bullied around a little bit. And after that, he actually told the Cavaliers training staff that he wasn't going to go back to California. He was going to stay with them and put on weight. And I think that was an interesting decision for him. But then also just the fact that he had a big around him in Jarrett Allen, who could help him take on some of the physical brunt of playing center in the NBA. Evan Mobley's played more of a power forward role. Now, at some point, I think you'll probably get the most high-end production from him as a center because he can space the floor a little bit more as a center compared to as a 4. Gives him different matchups. Can kind of take advantage of some of that athletic profile that he possesses. But for the most part, Evan Mobley, I still think projects to be a top 3 player from this draft. Now, we're going to have some discussions on that because there's 4 guys that I think really have an argument to potentially be that. But Evan Mobley's been good so far, and I think he fit into the right situation, the right destination for him, especially early in his career to showcase some of those things, which is very different than the guy I had ranked 2nd in Jalen Green. And as of right now, if people were to go back and you have to kind of give me a truth serum and say, okay, if I had to rank these players 1 through 10 or 1 through 30 or whatever for this draft, where would Jalen Green kind of fall right now? And the answer is he wouldn't be the 2nd best player from this class up to this point. Now, I know he's had some production in terms of his points per game and just some of those raw numbers. Part of the reason is he's been a high usage player for the Houston Rockets, and they haven't won anything with him doing that. Now, thing is, if you're expecting a 19, 20, 21-year-old kid to win you a lot of games as a guard in a high usage role, you just really aren't in the understanding of how the game is right now. The NBA, it's very hard to win with young players. And when you are winning with the young player, it usually means that guy is generational. Jalen Green was not a generational prospect, but he was a really darn good prospect coming out of G League Ignite, kind of the beginning stages of that whole thing, which really threw a wrinkle into kind of the development pathway for him, kind of a setup league. And I think it was a difficult evaluation just because you're kind of basing, okay, what does this look like? What's it supposed to look like? How do we compare this to college film? And for me, I kind of landed on the fact that hey, even if he was inefficient for G League Ignite and had some bad shooting nights and was struggling in some ways, he was playing against pro players. And I think that was something I gave him the benefit of the doubt of. And I don't regret that necessarily. But up to this point, he hasn't proven to be the 2nd best player from the class. But I do think there are some reasons as to why, and it really comes down to the context and the team he's been playing for. So if we flash back, remember, this is the first draft after trading James Harden. So they trade James Harden, and they need a guard. And Jalen Green ends up becoming the long-term replacement for James Harden, or so we thought at the time. Maybe James Harden is teammates with Jalen Green as soon as this offseason. We'll have to see what happens there. But there's a lot of pressure on this young kid. Okay, there's a lot of expectations that he's going to maybe become the new face of the franchise, replacing a guy who was an MVP player, should have won multiple MVPs, scored 36 points a game one season, just a fantastic overall player. And Jalen Green had huge shoes to fill, and he had the wrong coach to do it with, and Steven Silas, who just clearly didn't really know what he was doing, only lasted 3 years with the organization before being fired. And ultimately, Jalen Green, so far his early returns of his career, I don't think you can fairly say that it's Jalen Green's fault that he hasn't been a winning player. And I don't think it's fair to say that, oh, well, Jalen Green's bad because he's been inefficient. I mean, what? He was playing with Dyson Nix. That's his point guard. Like, There's a lot of structural flaws in Houston, which I think this offseason is going to probably fix a lot of those. And I think this is really the first year going into year 3 of his career. This is going to be the first year that we can properly assess Jalen Green and say, look, these are the things he's actually really good at and the things he's actually really not good at, especially offensively. Now, defensively, he needs to improve. There's definite flaws here still as a player. And you could argue that Evan Mobley, his defensive impact significantly outweighs potentially what Jalen Green could do offensively. And I think there's good legitimacy to that. And you could say the same thing with Scottie Barnes possibly as well. Does Jalen Green end up not being the second best player from the draft? 100% that's a likelihood. But at the same time, you could argue that maybe with the right coach, with Ime Udoka in there, and the right setting, right system around him, maybe a true point guard more instead of this Kevin Porter Jr. combo guard where you have two guys who are high volume shooters. Like, it's just going to look different. I think if they do get Harden, it's going to really advance Jalen Green's game. It's going to take a lot of pressure off of him and put him in situations to take a huge step forward. And I think Houston, they'll be an interesting team to watch. I think they're going to be, out of every team in the league, they're going to be one of the 3 most interesting teams to watch next year. I would rank them and San Antonio in the top 3 because Victor is going to be just so much fun to watch, and he's going to be a player that you should keep your eye on his entire rookie season. But I think Jalen Green is going to be one of the players that we learn the most about over the next 82 games the Houston Rockets play. And that leads me to number 1 on my board from this draft, and that was Cade Cunningham. And throughout the entire process, I never wavered on Cade Cunningham being the number 1 player in the draft because I remember watching his junior year high school film, and I remember watching his senior year high school film. And for me, I just, the talent was too immense. He had too many skills that I just couldn't avoid saying this guy's number 1 in the draft. Because, and I ended up being right about it. I mocked him number 1 the entire year. People were saying, well, maybe Jalen Green, maybe Evan Mobley. I never wavered on it. He ended up going first overall. Now, he did miss the entire second season, basically. Only played 12 games this past year because of a shin injury. So maybe people's perception on him right now is tilted a little bit. But Cade Cunningham, I think, is going to end up being a good player in this league for sure. And I think toward the back end of his rookie year, we saw that. I think he's going to be somewhat of a slow starter. He was that way at Oklahoma State. And by the end of their 30-plus game season, he was playing great basketball for the Rebels. Or for the Cowboys, excuse me. And for Cade Cunningham, I think that we saw that his rookie year as well, where he struggled quite a bit as a rookie, especially early in his career. Some people within the first 3 weeks of the season were saying, oh, is this a bust? Is this somebody that maybe the Pistons should have taken Jalen Green, or maybe the Pistons should have taken somebody else? You know, there was going to be there's always those discussions every year. I mean, if Victor Wembanyama scores like 12 points his first game as a rookie, people are going to say, whoa, should they have taken Scoot Henderson or Brandon Miller? Like, no, the answer to that is no, but people will always say certain things, and it's just, sometimes it's ridiculous. Cade Cunningham, I still believe, will end up being the best player from the draft, although I think it's going to be a little bit tighter than I originally suspected. But I think we just have to give him time. Okay, he's played less than 82 games in his career so far. So you can't just base everything off of what a player's been, and he's also been injured. Okay, so I think that there's still plenty of room for Cade Cunningham to progress, show us what he really is as a player, and I don't think we've seen the best of Cade Cunningham, not even close yet. So I would say don't sell your stock on Cade Cunningham yet at this point, even though that's probably the popular thing to do right now. Just be patient with him. I think we're going to end up seeing him kind of give validation to maybe that number 1 ranking I had for him before the 2021 NBA draft. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to hear kind of what your big boards looked like from the 2021 draft. If you have them, please send them to me. Otherwise, I just hope you did enjoy. If you did, leave a like. Subscribe to the channel for more content like what you saw in this video, especially if you're new. There's a lot of 2023 NBA draft content on the channel, so I would love for you to check it out. And we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.